Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kirsten Martzi, and I'm the Manager of Education and Community Engagement Programs at Brattleboro Museum and Art Center. It's my pleasure to present tonight's talk with Renée Ater and Roberto Visani, followed by a Q&A with all of you. Admission for this program is pay as you wish. If you would like to donate to Brattleboro Museum and Art Center to support this and future arts programs, you can do so at brattleboromuseum.support. And you'll be able to find information on membership at that page as well. This event is presented in connection with the exhibit Roberto Visani, Form Reform, which is on view through June 12th at BMAC. In tonight's program, Roberto will give an overview of his exhibit, followed by a talk about the art historical depictions of slavery by Renée Ater, and finishing with a Q&A with all of you. You're welcome to ask questions at any time, and we will save time at the end for Renée and Roberto to answer them. To submit a question or comment, if you're here on Zoom, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, you can use the comment function there, and we'll keep an eye on that too. So with that housekeeping taken care of, I'd like to ask Roberto and Renée to join me on the screen while I introduce them. So Roberto Visani is a multimedia artist living in Brooklyn, New York, and he's also faculty at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And he received an MFA from the University of Michigan and BFA from Minnesota University. He has exhibited his work internationally, and he's been an artist in residence at the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, the Atlantic Center for the Arts, and Cooper Union. He's a past Fulbright Scholar and recipient of a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship in Sculpture. His exhibit, Form Reform, is his first solo exhibit featuring a series of cardboard sculptures that are recreations of art historical depictions of enslaved people. And not only are these sculptures on display, but they are also available for sale in the form of do-it-yourself kits that Visani calls cardboard slave kits, produced between 2020 and 2022. Roberto's sculptures re-examine art historical depictions of the institution of American chattel slavery and examine the Black body through a reinterpretation of historical artworks and artifacts. And Renée Ater is a public scholar who works at the intersection of art and history. She's passionate about three-dimensional form, monuments, statues, and public art. And Renée holds a BA in art history from Oberlin College, an MA in art history from the University of Maryland, and a PhD in art history from the University of Maryland. And she's taught in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at the University of Maryland from 2000 to 2017. And currently she's the Provost Visiting Associate Professor in Africana Studies at Brown University, where she's taught several courses on monuments. And her research and writing have focused on the intersection of race, monument building, and public space. She continues to expand the open source Omeka project, Contemporary Monuments to the Slave Past. And she explores how the meaning of monuments shift and mutate over time, offering us new ways of understanding and engaging the past in the present. So Renée and Roberto, welcome. And welcome everyone who's joining us tonight. Thank you for being here. And Roberto, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Before I begin, let me thank the Brattleboro Museum, David Rios, the curator of the exhibition, and also my co-presenter tonight, Renée Ater, because I've followed her work for a while, so it's a real pleasure to be here and be able to exchange ideas. So I prepared a little PowerPoint presentation that I'd like to share. Rather than just give a general description of the exhibition, I thought because there's text on the website and in the exhibition that just sort of gives a general description, I thought I would talk a little bit more specifically about some of my motivations as an artist. So let me pull up a PowerPoint and I wanted to talk a little bit about the work I'm doing in this project from the standpoint of pedagogy. And I see the Cardboard Slave Kit project existing within the visual art realm within the realm of education, and also within the realm of economics, in that how it ties back to some foundational things about slavery that we've inherited. So on the left is an image from Prince. This is in the mid-90s when he was having conflicts with his record label and the contract he had signed, and he sort of was saying that it's like slavery. And I kind of identify with that because this definition of slavery we have is incredibly broad. When we think about chattel slavery in America, it's one particular event over a long period of time. But even that we have a difficult time relating to because none of us were alive when the institution was happening. So the way we relate to it is through historical imagery and objects, ephemera. And then on the right is an image from Huckleberry Finn. It's an illustration that depicts the moment that Jim, who was an enslaved man who had escaped, encountered Huck Finn after he ran away from home. And Huck Finn, everyone thought he had been killed and thrown in a river, so Jim thinks that he's a ghost when he encounters him. So what initially got me interested in this project was the image on the far left, and also you see it reproduced on the far right as an illustration. And this is an image that I can't even remember the first time I saw it. Sometime when I was in school, probably soon after I started college or maybe even high school. As I began to learn about it, I began to learn how controversial it was. But it was an image, a very powerful image that kind of just stuck in my head. It's like one of those things I couldn't really forget. So around 2004, 2006 or so, I had been working with cardboard as a sculptural material, and sort of out of the blue, I thought, I've been making figurative work, related to the body. And out of the blue, I sort of thought, what if I turn this image into a kit, like something that anybody could make? And I kind of embraced this DIY aesthetic. I'm very attracted to material as a metaphor within my work. So cardboard was really intriguing, brought up all kinds of questions that I wanted to explore, but I didn't really have a way to make it at the time. So I began doing more research on the original image and other slave imagery, and found a very conflicted history behind these things. What the other thing that struck me is that these things exist within museum collections, and as such, they're kind of preserved. Their meaning is almost like frozen in time. And so I thought to engage it in our contemporary moment might allow us to maybe see this work from a different point of view. And I started drawing parallels between that original image. So one of the things that's controversial about that original image is that the man kneeling, he's enslaved and he's asking for his freedom rather than claiming his freedom. And as I show other works, and I'm sure when Renée speaks, she'll talk about all these different narratives that sort of play out in the original works. But I immediately saw a parallel between this kneeling pose and Colin Kaepernick's protests and Eric Reed. This work from the late 60s by David Hammond's Pray for America, and also a relationship to the civil rights movement in the role that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King played, because Malcolm X was seen as being more of a confrontational by any means necessary, whereas Martin Luther King was advocating peaceful solutions by whatever way. At least that's the narrative that we've been taught. There were also some art movements that I was interested in referring back to, and that informed me as I was thinking about this kit, because the idea from the beginning was that anybody could make this. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that, again, was a form of pedagogy, thinking that the durational aspect of making this, whether it takes somebody 2 weeks or a month or a year, allows a kind of meditation on the subject, and also the possibility that this kit could be made collaboratively. It could be made by a group of people. Within that, conversations could begin to deconstruct and reconstruct what the conversation around the work meant today and what it meant historically. So the image that we're looking at is a flux kit, kind of designed by George McAnuis, and a number of Fluxus artists would contribute to it. And it's just various art objects, prompts that function a lot like a kit. It's meant to be used and assembled. So it's not a static work that would sit on a wall or on a pedestal simply to be looked at, but it's something to be engaged, opened up. There's directions in there to follow. In a similar light, Sol LeWitt and how he approached a lot of his art making has been very informative to this project. So he created a series of drawings and sculptures that exist as a set of instructions. And that means that the drawings after a time could be destroyed, and then art handlers, craftspeople later on could come to his instructions and recreate the work. And he sort of decided the parameters around that. So all of these things were kind of informing how I was thinking about constructing the kit. But more than that, I think, was this relationship to slavery. So the kit is intentionally made out of cardboard, which is an ephemeral material. It's also somewhat ubiquitous. Like, we always think that there's more cardboard. If we throw it out, we're going to get more. It can be recycled. And all these kinds of ideas about the material, it's used for shipping and commerce. All these things about the material, in some strange way, kind of echoed the institution of slavery for me. So on the left is a fully realized kit, which is built. And then the top middle, you see the kit that it comes in. Inside are a number of sheets of laser cut cardboard that are labeled and numbered. And then the other two images on the far right and the bottom are the manual that's enclosed in there. There's also a certificate of authenticity, which gives the rights to reproduction. And a lot of my thinking about creating multiples, because it's an open edition, and the pricing and things like that was related to the institution of slavery. Like, I just used that as kind of a guide to suggest what I do next, what kind of decisions I make about how many, how big, how much it costs, things like that. One thing I noticed last year was the first time I showed this work at a gallery in New York. I showed two pieces. I showed the cardboard slave kit abolitionist blend, which you see on the left, the head and the arms, and then in the background is a cardboard slave kit H. Powers blend, which is based on Hiram Powers' Greek slave. So I became very aware that these images of enslaved people, although there was a common sort of foundation in terms of expressing some ideas around chattel slavery in the Americas, they all were sort of coming at this idea from different perspectives. And as I could, when I would show them together, 2, 3, 4, in the case of the exhibition at the museum, 6, another kind of conversation came up. It started to complicate, and in some ways for me, enrich the conversation around what slavery was, and maybe some of its after effects that we are sort of inheriting. The other thing that I noticed, which is sort of, you might get a sense of on the right, is the relationship that the visual language that I had, that I was using, which is this sort of what's called low poly, these sort of abstracted triangles that would make up the figures, how they would connect in some strange way to some of this architecture of the spaces that I was showing in. These kind of like neoclassical window frames and door frames and staircases and things like that. There seemed to be some odd kind of relationship between those two visual aesthetics that I've been very interested in exploring. So these are just a few images that that I've been looking at and made artwork from. I'm sure that when Renee speaks, she'll speak in more detail about these, so I'm not going to go into a lot of the historical background of them, but I do like to reference the originals if I can. So in the middle and on the far right, those are the original models of the Greek slave and Carpo's Why Born Enslaved that were then subsequently copied in marble and other materials. And then on the left is Carl Brudhagan's Emancipation statue in Barbados, which is a newer work. But what strikes me again is this conversation. You know, you have this sort of triumphant figure on the far left. You have this very vulnerable, you know, hypersexualized female form in the middle. And then on the right, you have this sort of overly sexualized female form, but she has this sort of almost defiant or sort of removed glance. So those kinds of expressions are incredibly interesting for me to explore, especially through abstraction and how much I can sort of simplify the form, but yet retain some of these emotional qualities in the material. And this is another installation image from the exhibition showing three works kind of, again, you see that a dialogue starts to happen between them. This is the last piece I did was, you know, based on Eastman Johnson's A Ride for Liberty. And I have to say that, like I mentioned earlier, the durational aspect of the works, like the fact that it takes me some time to build it, does become a meditation on what the pieces really mean to me. And I identified with this in some strange way. I have a 4-year-old son, and you know, I just had very kind of, you know, powerful experience making the little boy that rides on top of the horse. So out of that sort of meditation and process of creating these things, they start on the computer screen and I'm moving them around, zooming in and out. Every now and again, I will catch a glimpse of part of the larger sculpture, which begins to redefine the narrative in some way to me. So the image on the left is titled Learning to Ride. You know, I'm creating this cardboard sculpture of this little boy, and I'm thinking like this is how he's learning to ride, you know, escaping slavery, crossing Union lines to freedom, which seemed like a really powerful thing. And then the role of chains in slavery and how important that is, not only in artworks, but in the actual institution, and how it relates to things like jewelry and things like that, seem to be really prophetic in the other drawing you see on the right. And I like to frame them in these sort of oval antique frames, again, kind of tying these two visual aesthetics together of this digital kind of form of expression with this more kind of neoclassical way of articulating something. So those are the images I brought to share with you today. Thanks.
Thanks, Roberto. You know, I already have like 5,000 questions. I could just skip my presentation and go straight to the questions, but we'll do that at the end. But I'm really interested. Fluxus is one of your main influences because you immediately reminded me of Ben Patterson's work with Instructions, who is a member of Fluxus. So we can talk about that later. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So I have you know, I will talk for a little bit. I want to be really aware of time, so I don't want to run over. So we have plenty of time to actually answer some of the questions. But I'm really here to talk about the historical depictions of slavery. I am actually trained as a sculptor historian. I've worked with in particular June Hargrove, who is a 19th century French specialist, but really kind of turned me on to the three-dimensional world. And I also taught these classes on sculpture and continue to teach a lot of classes around monuments and what they mean and what these objects mean. So let's start actually with, and I hope everyone can see this. I'm going to can see the top of this, one of the interesting things is about doing this online, you realize that that thing at the top blocks. But to actually just start here with the Josiah Redwood, who was a potter and quite famous, as some of you may know, created these anti-slavery medallions. And around 1787 is when the first was created. And he created a ceramic medallion in support of the abolition of the slave trade. And so he made it very specifically for the Committee for the Abolition of Slave Trade on the 5th of July, 1787. And what we see is two different forms, but the small kind of cameo that could be worn. We see, though, the most kind of important iconography here, or the way that the image tells us things, is this kneeling image of a Black African enslaved man. And we know this partly because of the way in which Josiah Wedgwood's factories handled the rendering of the face. So there is this kind of emphasis on this idea of a kind of a Black physiognomy that we see here, and really curly hair, but he's using classical form, and Roberto mentioned this, but the kind of rise of neoclassicism with the entrenchment of slavery produces some very interesting imagery. But here we see effectively a nude male with a drape around his genitals, and then we see that he is actually, in this case, completely manacled. We see the shackles here on his legs, and he's manacled at his wrists, and he has his hands in that prayer gesture. Now, this image, for one thing, thousands of these, there was many of thousands of these produced, were distributed throughout the 1790s. Although what's really interesting, it's hard because Redwood did not actually keep track of these in the same way that he did the pottery that he was selling for profit. And they became actually very interesting, which I think there's a whole paper to be written about this, and maybe there already has been, but as fashion accessories, particularly for men and women who were really proposing the complete abolishment of slavery in England in particular, which sort of happens in 1807 with it's declared illegal to import slaves from Africa, but there's still the British Caribbean, where there is actively using enslaved labor. And so it's not until about 1833 that the British abolish slavery fully. But these were worn as brooches, they were as buckles. People had them inlaid in gold and set into snuff boxes. Women wore them as bracelets. They were sometimes created and attached to pins that women wore in their hair. So it was this idea that one was displaying one's politics, quite frankly, that they're promoting the cause of justice and humanity and freedom in their mind. So this image was really readily reproducible. And it derived from this tract, and I'm showing you, and I'm sorry this kind of cut out image on the right, but I'm showing you one of the tracts from the abolition of the slave trade. So we see here the image printed, this is 1788, printed at the bottom of this tract, that is a letter to the treasurer of the society, instituted for the purpose of effecting the abolition of the slave trade. So here, this is the 4th edition of this, we see again this print. So it was one of the things I think, particularly in print form, it was easily reproducible. With the contrast between, quite frankly, the cross-hatching here to suggest Black skin, and then the white area of the cloth left free. And I should just mention that this image is deeply related to, the Greco-Roman classical tradition. And so this kind of handling of the body that I'll come back to, but this very intense focus on muscles, on the abdominals, on the flexed muscles of the leg, tensile strength of his toes pushing against the ground as if he literally is about to stand up. This kind of image of the semi-nude black male saying, "Am I not a man or a brother?" just gets reproduced over and over in a variety of ways, not just on these medallions, these cameos, but in paintings, in prints, in a sculpture. And so I'll kind of address this in a little bit about how this image, in my mind, is closely related to John Quincy Adams Ward's image of the freedman, which I'll get to, and one source that Roberto uses in the exhibition. So I wanted to take a little time to actually talk about the Greek slave, because this, for me, there's not just one version. There are numerous versions of this that are slightly different, which is interesting to me that 6 male collectors in the mid-19th century were interested in this object and commissioned it. It is one of the most famous, to me, sculptures in American history. It's by Hiram Powers, initially modeled between 1841 and 43. So you'll notice that I'm doing something here where I show the model date very early on and then the carved date. And so the Corcoran Gallery of Art, which is now subsumed by the National Gallery of Art, and so this object is now in the collection of the National Gallery of Art, but was originally purchased by William Corcoran, and it is the version that traveled widely around the United States, and I believe is the version that was also shown at the Crystal Palace in 1851, a huge international exposition that was held in London. But let's just look at these 2 versions. One's from Newark and the other on the left from the Corcoran, and they share some similarities. One thing that's really the subject of this that is so interesting to me, that there could be this gap in understanding of Powers' kind of production of this. This is really the first nude female body to circulate in the US. And they created a marketing campaign of all marketing campaigns to sell this to a very nervous American public about viewing nudity in public. So that's one thing that's interesting to me, is the kind of, quite frankly, genius that they were able to convince Americans somehow that they were not truly looking at a nude body, but instead were witnessing this story, this narrative that kind of circulated, and in both the brochures, but also in the sculpture itself, and in articles and poetry, and just the amount of writing on this sculpture at mid-century is simply astounding to me, that so many Americans engaged the object in that way. But let's look at the image on the left at the Corcoran Gallery of Art. And the subject, first of all, is supposed to rep, it's called the Greek slave, a Greek Christian maiden, and who is about to be sold into slavery to the Turks during the Greek attempts to overthrow the Turks in the Greek War of Independence. So this is ostensibly the historical narrative that is going on in this image. But what we see are a couple things. We see a completely nude female body in white marble, the material of neoclassical sculptors who were from the United States, but training in Rome, in Florence, in Italy. So they go to Rome and Florence because there's not access quite to these kinds of materials in the U.S. And there's, of course, the amazing Carrara marbles that are hard and really beautiful sheen that are very attractive to American artists. So they set up shop, in Rome or Florence, and are working with Italian master carvers to create these objects. So here we see an image of a woman who is looking down, and there is this little bit of what I've always understood in this sculpture of voyeurism, this kind of titillation that she doesn't engage our gaze, but we're allowed to really kind of take in her entire body and kind of consume her. And I'll show you some images of this. But her hair is pulled back into a bun, and we see this amazing, remarkable handling of the texture of the hair. We see that she is indeed meant to be this kind of white woman embodied in white marble. She has full breasts, this kind of mounded belly. We can see her pubic mound here. And then we see that she is kind of shackled at her hands, and we see two chains that are actually carved in marble, and both the the Corcoran and Newark Museum's examples. And we see that she's doing something that is so indebted to the kind of the Greco-Roman sculpture, and that is that S curve, that contrapposta, where there's this very slight S curve going through her body, right? One knee slightly bent, and then she rests her hand on this pillar on both sides because partly for support in the structure of it. And we see that her shawl has been pulled off as she's exposed, right, to the Turkish buyer. So what we know is that Hiram Powers worked from a live model. She was a young Italian woman with a chaperone. She posed for the figure naked with her clothes on a support so that he could get that. There is a cross, which is, we can just see here, it's a little hard on my sides, but there's a cross indicating that she is Christian. And that's really important, that it is through her faith that she kind of endures this slavery. And also a locket up on the version from the Corcoran, which symbolizes this love, this connection to family as well, and then bound at her wrist. And these are obviously, I'm showing you from slightly different angles, but that kind of twisting of her body with her head to the side, her breast forwarding, and her feet slightly apart. But there's this sexualized nature of this work for sure. It's impossible to ignore that. What's really interesting is how Hiram Powers reflected back on this in 1869. He does not raise the image issue at this point, particularly in the 1840s, of Black women being in real bondage in the United States, a country from which he is from. Instead, he said these were Christian women. I'm quoting here. And it is not difficult to imagine the distress and even despair of the sufferers while exposed to be sold to the highest bidders. But as there should be a moral in every work of art, I have given to the expression of the Greek slave what trust there could still be in divine providence for the future state of existence, with utter despair for the present, mingled with somewhat scorn for those all around us. Already, I'm so fascinated about how Hiram Powers kind of builds this story of an inanimate object as if she is a real physical, a Christian woman who is about to be defiled. So the second statue, and the most significant thing that happens between this later moment in 1869, and this is in the Brooklyn Museum of Art. So this was carved in 1851, and there's kind of a gap. There's six casts, one that's inaccessible in England, and one I believe in Ireland. But we see that he's done something really significant with this. Really, the sixth version of this. He's changed the manacles to something that might look more similar to manacles in the time of slavery. We are in the post-slavery moment, right? 1865 has come and gone. And so clearly there is this kind of shift in the story of the Greek slave where it becomes more, some way, more meaning embedded, tied to the enslavement of Africans in America. So it has its source. So one of the things that I want to be sure that we think about in relationship to all of this sculpture is it's based in kind of Roman copies of Greek works and the idea that the sculpture is white. Now we know that classical sculpture was in fact painted, which would have been spectacular to see. But we do know, in fact, that Hiram Powers saw this Roman copy of Aphrodite of Knidos. And we can see that same kind of slight hitch in the hip that gives us that slight S curve dumbing down here straight on if her legs were still attached. But again, here he borrows a little bit of the idea of the drapery as support over an urn. But this kind of full, beautiful, right, image of Aphrodite, but also of a sexualized female body. And this, of course, is even stressed even more with this image by James Prater of an odalisque. Really kind of the rise at the time that, particularly later on, the rise of both literary and visual Orientalism, starting throughout kind of in the early 1800s and forward. So this idea or depictions of aspects of Middle Eastern and East Asian cultures in the role of kind of fantasy and an imagined realm of the East, but also this idea, the odalisque as being in the harem. So this kind of obsession with sexuality, with sensuality, with this really constructed idea of the harem as the epitome of Eastern sexuality, a world of forbidden desire, without really thinking about how did harems function? How could women actually be oppressed within those kinds of systems? But so here we see this sculpture where she's just after the bath, kind of gazing over her shoulder. But again, we see this real interest, right, in modeling this kind of full, figured, a white female body for the male gaze. And I can't stress that enough, particularly with something like James Pradier's statue. So around 1850, Hiram Powers, with his friend Minor Kellogg, managed to tour the sculpture in the United States around 1848. And I'll show you some images from that. So they tour it, and it is a remarkable success. And they have this brochure and I'll talk about the image on the right, because obviously the British got the problem. But they circulated, and in our minds, it's hard for us to understand, but this was kind of the blockbuster event of its time period. You could pay your 25 to 50 cents and go and actually see the sculpture in person, lit by gaslight, kind of enshrined in red drapery, really this deep red drapery. So it made her skin look pinker. So there's all this manipulation when this sculpture was on exhibit to make it look more human, which is also quite interesting to me. But when it travels to this should be in another place, but when it travels to England in 1851 to the Crystal Palace, Punch, kind of a satirical journal in England, and they've abolished slavery. So they're feeling, in 1833, they enacted this slave abolition law. So they're feeling like, why can't America see the irony of this, that they still have enslaved women? And so they created this kind of satirical cartoon. And so what you see is a Black woman who is not looking downward, but there's no eyes, but her eyes are kind of rolled back looking up. She has a headdress on, full-breasted here, again using the quality of the line to suggest her Black skin, but she is completely here shackled with chains, and then draped across, instead of her shawl that would have protected her and kept this woman covered, instead it's the American flag, right, to point out this hypocrisy of how can you talk about this fear of enslavement of white women when in the reality Black women are enslaved around the globe. So here we see this woman enslaved, attached to this pillar here with a flag on it. And then if you notice on the bottom are whips. So here are the chains all around the base of an e pluribus unum out of many one. Well, they're really pointing out this kind of irony of the beaten Black body, the violence and trauma of slavery suggested here through the image of the whip. And it says, intended as a companion to Powers' Greek slave. So there were people who were aware that there was a problem with this story that Minor Kellogg and Hiram Powers were telling. And once he could kind of gloss over the statue's nudity and actually gloss over this kind of sensational story of her being sold into sexual servitude, they could really talk about this idea that she is communing with God, that she is has the resignation of a good Christian woman, will keep her faith no matter what, shows no shame because she is a Christian. And so this kind of duality of the statue and what it's doing continues to this day, I would argue, in how we understand it. So when it was, I'm showing on the left, when it was shown around 1848, you could pay, 25 cents to come see. There were days where only ladies and families would come. So this idea that there's a little bit of kind of titillation at looking at this, that somehow it was an erotic experience, so that women and their children and families could become separate from when perhaps men were at the site. So you see this advertisement. I believe I pulled this from the Library of Congress several years ago. But they're talking about, we're going to next ship it off to the Crystal Palace. And all of this to me really ties into the way that Roberto has used the Greek slave as one of these early cardboard slave kits. And here we have where it's this white cardboard, this idea of suggesting the whiteness of the marble. But I really liked his comments about cardboard as tied to the marketplace, because certainly Black women's bodies were tied to the marketplace, as was the actual production of the sculpture, and the circulation of the sculpture was tied to the marketplace. And this idea that there are 50,000 visitors coming every day to see the object. And that people wrote poems, including the famous and not so famous, and some really bad poetry, some interesting poetry. But Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote a poem to it as well. And I'll just read the first few lines where she says, "They say ideal beauty cannot enter the house of anguish. On the threshold stands an alien image with enshackled hands, called the Greek slave, as if the artist meant her. That passionless perfection which he lent her, shadowed not darkened where the sill expands, to so confront man's crime in different lands with man's ideal sense. Pierce to the center art's fiery finger, and break up ere long the serfdom of this world. Appeal, fair stone, from God's pure heights of beauty against man's wrong. Catch up in thy divine face not alone. East Greece by west, and stream and strike and shame the strong, by thunders of white silence overthrown." Again, I can't say enough this idea of ideal beauty. But also, it's with this poem, it's really interesting to think about this tension between Browning talking about this white woman being enslaved, and also what seems to me hints at the state of slavery in the United States. So you could see the show traveled around the United States. I believe it was in New York, Baltimore, D.C., and maybe Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. And then it was shown at the Great Exhibition in the Crystal Palace in the East Nave. And again, this idea of display is really important. So here, and this we know from photographs, but also from the way this was reproduced at the time period in these chromolithographs, we can see her again enshrouded with that kind of white, the red velvet drapery to suggest her skin. And we can see various ways of people. The woman's looking at it, the children are looking away, one young girl looks back at her, the man glances straight at us. We're not sure what their viewing practices say to them. What do they see when they look at this sculpture, for sure? And then it was shown at the Dusseldorf Gallery, and what you're seeing is kind of salon stacked paintings here, rows and rows and rows of hundreds of paintings with the Greek slave shown at the gallery in New York City. And what is so interesting, again, is one of the things I ask my students to think about is like, what is happening? What are people looking at? What are they talking about? How are they women sometimes talked about they swooned before the sight of the Greek slave. So these kind of narratives around this statue, around its seemingly non-sexuality, yet Christian faith, but the fact is that she was a nude figure, and people were intensely, in the beginning, surprised at this. But in the end, it was the most popular artwork at mid-century in the 1850s in the United States. Over 100,000 people, as they said, paid to see it during the 1847-1848 tour. And on the whole, American responses in general, except for that punch response, was silent about the relationship between Greek slaves and African enslavement, slavery. Even when exhibited in southern cities, it actually traveled to New Orleans as well. And I can see where in New Orleans, actually, you could just avoid that conversation, right? Because it becomes about something else in that context, as well as one of the major internal slave cities in the United States. I can imagine that they didn't want to talk about the enslavement of Black women, which was happening in auction houses in New Orleans during this time period. So we have this sculpture in which Roberto has engaged in a really interesting way. And then we have John Quincy Adams' Ward, the Freedman. And it's doing something actually somewhat similar, a little bit differently, but it's turning to that neoclassical tradition. And I'm sorry I don't have an image. It's based on the Belvedere torso and a Roman copy again. But this absolute, again, instead of his manacle is broken, so that is quite shackles are broken, and he seems to have self-emancipated, and that is one of the most significant things. But he's still sitting down. He's still in the guise of a Greco-Roman body, right? And so there's an intense detail to physiognomy, to the body itself. And I just want to point here that there is another artist who is doing, and she is a Native American Black artist, Monia Lewis, who in 1865, after the Civil War, goes to Rome and becomes an expatriate and spends the rest of her life living in Rome. Kirsten Buick has written a fabulous book about it, about Monia Lewis. But we see here, and Monia Lewis is a little different from most artists who are going to Rome. She does her own carving. Which I actually think is why occasionally there are these proportion issues in her work. But what is so important about her conception of freedom, this idea of forever free, even if it's using neoclassical vocabulary, right? The white marble, the handling of the torso, it attempts to show that freedom is for men and women, but there's something else going on because the woman is kneeling in prayer, and it is in fact the Black man who is broken, right? This ball and chain at her feet, who has liberated her. She has no kind of capacity for self-liberation here, but she's praying to a higher being. But we can see this kind of triumphal raising of the fist here. And let me just do one more, and then I think I'll stop because so we can have some time to answer questions and chat. I'll stop here at the Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux, or actually I want to do the next image quickly, but the Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux called Pourquoi? Why? Naître en slave. So why born enslaved? And this is Carpeaux is there's a big Carpeaux show up at the Met if you're interested. But Carpeaux did lots of images of really astounding images materially of enslaved Black people. And with why born enslaved is also one of these. Probably it was modeled in 1868, carved around 1873. It was one of the most well-known late 19th century sculptures of an enslaved figure. And what you're seeing here is a composition that was modeled on an unidentified woman. And it's not a portrait, even though it's modeled on a woman, but there's something really, this idea of her bound by the rope around her breast, this kind of sexualized of the Black female body here, with her breast pushing above the rope, bound behind her legs and behind her arms. And then we see this intense, what I would say, kind of agony on her face. The brow furrowed, her looking upward, and that's in the exhibition with Roberto's work. There's this the Carpeaux, his realization of it in cardboard is looking back at the painting, and so there's that kind of gaze. What does it mean in that instance of these shared gazes? Now, when it was showed, and one point I do want to make here, it was not called Why Born Enslaved. It was actually in 1869 exhibited at, I believe, the Paris Salon, and it was called Negresse, Negresse, which was a negresse was a term used to kind of denigrate Black women. It set her aside based on based on her skin color, right? Based on certain ideas that there were a human difference. And so in that sense, it's the title, and I'll have to figure this out when the title actually gets reattached to it, why, or is attached to it, Why Born Enslaved. It seems to convey this anti-slavery material, this anti-slavery position, but really, so it's interesting. The Met wants to say this is defiant. I see it as both defiant, but also anguish, really, the way her hair is part of that anguish, the way in which Carpeaux has modeled it. But again, it's this idea of not only the Black woman, female in bondage, but really for us to gaze upon that Black body. And I want to end here because I've written a lot about this monument, and it's another image that actually a lot of sculptors resisted making public monuments after Thomas Ball. It takes actually until Augustus St. Gaudens makes the monument to Robert Gould Shaw and the 54th Massachusetts Regiment for there to be a monument that really ennobles Black people. But Thomas Ball creates this memorial to Abraham Lincoln in 1876. And what's so interesting about this, what we've just recently discovered, several historians, is that in fact, it is again this kind of idea of the white president bestowing freedom upon the black man who's not responsible for his own freedom, which is really an astounding difference from the statue in Bridgetown of Basu, of the kind of rebellion against slavery, of stepping forward. But again, it's still using that semi-nude body as a form. So why don't I stop here just so we have time to chat, I think. I'll stop sharing, and then I can always talk at the end about the Eastman Johnston, because it's a quite powerful image about the Battle of Manassas in 1862, right? And this
Yeah.
couple fleeing there. So I can talk about that later. But shall we open up for conversation, I think, since it's 7:50? Does that sound good, Kirsten? Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I know that Roberto and Renee, you may have questions for each other. We have a couple questions in the chat, but I was wondering if you two wanted to chat a little bit while people kind of gather their thoughts.
So Roberto, I want to talk about Fluxus and your work, because I'm really interested. So I participated in a reenactment of a Ben Patterson Fluxus performance at the Getty.
Oh,
And it
wow.
was one of the most interesting things I've ever done. We were kind of given a kit and told to, wash our face on stage. But I'm really interested in this idea. I only just connected the Fluxus to the cardboard kit. So could you talk about that? Because I think that's significant, of this
Yeah.
kind of durational event as a moment of us each creating that interaction with both the past but also the present.
Well, there's actually a earlier precedent for me
Mm,
than Fluxus, and that's really West African traditions and carnival traditions in the
mm,
West Indies that um, have a lot to do with call and response. And you see that tradition carried forth into the Black church.
mhm,
So the premise of it, which I connect to Fluxus and then this, the cardboard slave kits, is this idea of group participation
mhm,
within the work of art. That rather than the artist, the creator being like the sole proprietor of expression, and then having this dichotomy between the work and the audience, to sort of find strategies to conflate them. And so I think the Fluxus, in terms of the contemporary art movement,
mhm,
embody that very much in Ellen Capro and Happenings.
mhm,
Maybe Soul the Wit a little bit less so, because they're kind of, once they're created, they're static objects. But I
mhm.
was really interested in this call and response, this back and forth
Yeah.
between the audience and the work, and how the audience would have a role in deciding what the work meant.
Yeah.
And this, in a way, this ties back to slavery, because I think that the reason that I showed the Huckleberry Finn image in the beginning, that's how I was taught about slavery in school.
Mm,
Reading Huck Finn, it was a very short,
yeah.
In terms of our history class, it was a short, I think, a week or something like that.
Mhm.
And the relationship that book had at the time it was meant to the American public, as opposed to now, is completely different.
Yeah.
So I think it's not only how we engage works, but it's also the media that's used, the construction, and all those kinds of things that
Mhm.
that help to reinform. Like when you're talking about the Greek slave and you're talking about red velvet, for an artist to do that today seems somewhat absurd, right?
Mhm.
But at the time, it made a whole lot of sense. So
Well, and I wonder about, I mean, one of the interesting things you said is that this idea that objects are frozen in time in collections, but I think what curators do is to tell us new stories about these objects that seem
yeah.
frozen. And one of the things about the cardboard slave kits that I'm really fascinated is the idea that you're building a three-dimensional object, and so that kind of actual physical interaction of making a thing builds the meaning. Is that how you're? I'm just wondering about that. Like, how is meaning created for the person making the object?
Yeah, I mean, as a sculptor, I'm a tactile thinker for the most part. I
Mhm.
mean, I'm also, think conceptually, but I know some artists, and they will come up with an idea in their head and do some sketches and photographs, and then take it to fabricators to make
Mhm.
the work. And my creative output doesn't work that way. When I touch material, when I bend it, cut it, that really feeds my understanding of what I'm making. So yeah, and then I think also there's this. I was brought up in the Catholic Church, and there's these performative things around objects. Also having studied African art and spent time in Africa, there's this performative thing around objects where they can, through their use, they can be imbued with new meaning, different meaning that's kind of like can be continually layered depending on libations or incense or words that are spoken and music that can sort of like shift and build the meaning of the sculpture itself, the physical form. So I'm working with a group of students now at John Jay College, my host institution, and we're going to be recreating one of the slave kits. We're going to be making one from scratch and building it to the end. And so I'm really interested we're going to be recording the process. So I'm really interested I think it's going to inform me a lot in terms of how the sculptures function.
And I know you have a question, but one thing that I thought was one of the things I had not even, quite frankly, made a connection between the Josiah Wedgwood, medallions or cameos, jewelry that circulated in the late 18th century. But that Colin Kaepernick and Eric Reed kneeling photograph, like you need to translate that into a work. Like there's something really, they've transformed that gesture, right? Like they've transformed that historical kneeling position into something quite different. And I just was really struck by that. The comparison is really in my mind now.
Yeah, I think that I like to think about that we define words and that words don't define us. Mm-hmm. And I would say the same thing for images. Mm-hmm. So, there's a tradition in African diaspora culture of taking certain images and words and flipping them. So rather than being negative, they're then looked at as positive. Yeah. And I think that the Kaepernick image does that. But it just that was just meditating on that on the Wedgwood figure and the implications and the critique around it.
And that kind of signifying that Kaepernick and Reed are doing is kind of amazing. So, are you ready for some questions?
Yeah, I also
have more to. I have more to say, but let's take the questions.
Yeah, I also wanted to say, when listening to you talk about the Greek slave, being in the gallery with Roberto's sculpture of the Greek slave, her gaze is so powerful, and seeing the slide that you had where she's looking off to the side and she's looking down in the museum with the scale of that statue, like her gaze is like seems much more powerful. So I just wanted to share that's kind of another like twist or
and she was often at the Smithsonian American Art. They have that model that you had that's really the pointing model to transfer from the plaster to the marble. But at one point, these sculptures were put on these pedestals that you turned a little crank and they turned around so that you could see, wow. Instead of walking around them, you could actually they had to disable it because kids were jumping on it in the museum and trying to turn the sculpture. But you could kind of crank this and have that experience of her kind of circulating in the space. Yeah. So that's cool. Interesting about the scale.
Yeah. I was we had a concert and I was sitting, so she was looking right at me, and I was changed in my experience of that sculpture. But I wanted to get to some questions. We had a couple questions from Ricky, and let's just see. They asked about thinking about how the Carpo and the Greek slave are sexualized. Asking why you refer to them that way. Is it a subjective opinion about objectifying the sexuality of the nude female statue but not the nude male form? Is that reflecting or projecting misogyny? But thinking about who decides what's sexualized and where does that interpretation come from?
So you mean my subject? I don't have a subjective opinion about this. Is that what
Right.
that question is? I don't think that's my subjective opinion. I think it's the way in which these objects were talked about. She was talked about in this very, what's so interesting to me, sure, it reflects their misogyny to a certain degree. I wouldn't even say it's even internalized. But if you read some of the criticism, there is this constant reference to white skin, to the kind of erotic, like women are titillated by it. This is reported in the newspapers of the time period as people are visiting, that women are kind of swooning at the sight of it, that men are having, little cigar talks around it. And so that idea about this kind of objectifying of the nude female happens in the 19th century. And Americans are really resistant to nude sculpture. And it is Hiram Powers that's kind of able to break that a little bit with the statue. And then we see many more of his sculptures enter the marketplace, but people were still really uncomfortable with this in the 1850s. To see a nude female body in public just was not acceptable in the mid 19th century for sure. So we don't understand the sexualization because that doesn't mean anything to us in the 21st century, right? I don't project my desires on a piece of white marble. But these sculptures, the way that both artists and critics of the time period talked about neoclassical sculpture was both in sexual terms, but as a stand-in for the body. And that's super interesting to me.
Yeah.
Charmaine Nelson has written brilliantly on this. If you're looking for something to read on this, I'll drop it in the chat. But Charmaine Nelson has written some really phenomenal stuff around this idea of the female body being sexualized in the 19th century and in white marble sculpture.
That's great. Thank you. Roberto, did you have something to add?
Yes, sorry about that. Ambulance was passing outside. Yeah, for me, in the Greek slave, it really has a lot to do with the position of the hands and the chain. That she's naked, the vaginal area is exposed, and it's almost like she's trying to cover it up, but then you can still see through that space. So there's this kind of like push-pull about how he's posed her hands in relationship to the body behind that. And with the Carpo, it's like I just got the sense from looking at it that her top was sort of like pulled down in a way, exposing her breasts with the rope. Like if she was free, she would cover herself up. So there's this kind of tension between, what a free body would want to do and what a captive body is the position a captive body is put into. And it's different in those two female figures for me than it is in the male figures that I was looking at. The male figures are not struggling with their, to keep their clothing on. They might be disrobed to a certain amount, to a certain degree, but it's not forced. It doesn't seem to be forced upon them in the works that I've looked at.
Yeah.
And I think it's not forced to them partly because they're using that Greco-Roman body. They're using the Belvedere torso over and over and over again, right? It's a sculpture that every mid-century American sculptor knows because they've gone to Rome, they've gone to Florence, they're looking at all these objects, right, and doing some of that translation into their own work.
Yeah, that's great clarifying. Thank you. We had another question from Ricky that I wanted to share because it relates to some local Brattleboro history. I don't know if you are aware, but a couple of years ago in 2020, some middle school students did some research on the Civil War Memorial in Brattleboro, and they found that on the plaque it was listed that 385 men enlisted, 31 died, but really, according to U.S. records, 450 served and 56 died, which means that there were 22 African American soldiers from Brattleboro, and 8 of whom died. So there's been this, the middle school students brought this up through their research, and there's been a push to put a new plaque in place. And I'm not sure where we are in that process, but Ricky asked if Roberto would be willing to discuss an RFP for the new Civil War monument corrections.
Well, I can't commit to anything, but I'm open to learning more about the situation. I mean, I think that they, people that gave their lives for this country in the Civil War, if there's a memorial, they should be acknowledged. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Whether or not I'm the one to create this or not, that's an open question. But I'm in favor of this being seriously considered for a change. Absolutely.
Yeah, and Ricky put in that Renee, if you're interested as well, anybody can submit one.
Well, it's
So,
interesting because we have one of these Civil War monuments in Providence that's ostensibly to the United States colored troops, and there are no colored troops on it, and there were none of their names, the USCT troops, put on it until recently by the local historical group. So they built this entire monument to honor their service without actually, and what you have on it is actually a semi-nude female body of a black enslaved woman that's a stand-in for the USCT. I mean, that in itself makes for a very, very messy commemorative here in Providence. And they are actually actively trying to decide what to do with the statue.
yeah, that's really interesting what's happening with all these monuments. And I just love that here in Brattleboro it was unearthed by middle school students.
Yeah, that's great. I love it.
Yeah.
I actually love that.
So Ricky, I'll be back in Brattleboro for the opening receptions and for artist curator talks. So if you're free, please come by the museum and maybe we can chat.
Yeah, that sounds good. And it's May 14th, and I have Ricky's contact information, so I can send it to you too, Roberto.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Roberto, can I ask you just one, if I can, unless you have some more questions? I do have a question about the cardboard as ephemeral and as ephemeral as throwaway. I mean, I love the way you talked about it, right? As this disposable material that is absolutely necessary. Like for our modern world, we couldn't kind of exist without it. But I was also thinking about the cardboard slave kits and about this idea that eventually they'll be recycled. I mean, right? Is that part of it too? Like there's an afterlife, like they will get grungy and kind of fall apart, and we might, like, do you imagine that, or do you want people to keep them as a Roberto Visani?
No, I mean, I think public collections and also to a certain extent private collections now are actively trying to digitize their collection. They sort of understand that, we have this fallacy that art lives forever, but it just doesn't. I mean, even sculptures that are made up with bronze and marble, they break.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to the British Museum in London, there's pockmarks on the outside of the building from all the shelling during World War II. So the idea that even if it's a material that is stable inherent, there's all kinds of other things that happen, wars and natural disasters and things like that. So I like the idea that it's archival in a way, that there's this digital archive that, and I found the certificate of authenticity. I used the Solowit certificate of authenticity as the starting point.
Yeah.
But if you own the kit, you're able to have one copy in existence at a time. Yeah. So if that one you have is destroyed, or you decide for whatever reason that you don't want to ship it someplace, and that it can just be remade.
Okay. Yeah, it's just it's really, because of course museums will keep them as a object that's not made, I'm guessing. They'll keep the kit, right? And so when you say digital archive, is that all of the digital work that goes into create? Like, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
So
Just if you could explain that a little further.
Yeah, so for people that own the kit, they also have access to a website with PDFs to reproduce it.
Okay.
And the manual. They just have to put a password in, and then take the PDF files to a laser cutter, and they can if it's part of it, if they need to remake the hands or the leg or something like that, they can. Everything is laid out that way, so they can print these 8 pages to remake this one particular part. If they decide they want to make the Greek slave out of brown and white cardboard, they could, or out of
Okay.
boxes that have labeling on it, they could. And that's what I mean. It's about this sort of open-ended reinterpretation of the original works.
I was thinking a little bit of it dissolving, let's say, in a garden setting, if you decided to put yours in a garden. And I was thinking of Joyce Scott's work, of the Harriet Tubman work she did at Ground for Sculpture, where the
Mhm.
sculpture disintegrated over the year, except for the rifle and the beads. And so all that was left were this very, these tactile shimmery objects, but also this very forceful object. But the idea of, and I was thinking about what you were saying about West Africa and the Caribbean. I was really thinking, I've been for some reason really obsessed with mbares, but thinking about this idea of an object that's built and then it's allowed to decay, that the decay is as much as part of the function of it as the physical object.
Yeah,
It's not advised I put it in my garden if I were to get one.
I'm I'm learning about this process now because the abolitionist blend this is the second time I've shown it, and I noticed that the cardboard's corrugated, so some of the corrugation on the corners is kind of like peeling up a little bit. It has a little bit of a patina to it, which
Yeah.
is I have mixed feelings about it. I like it, but then I also want it to have structural integrity, obviously, because of the
Okay.
exhibition.
We have a couple more comments I wanted to share with you both. Mary says, fabulous presentation and thanks to you both. And then Michael Abrams said, wonderful work and so well done. I'm enjoying the monumental and heroic aspects of the sculpture made accessible by the use of cardboard as a material. And Michael is an artist and exhibited at the museum in our last round of shows. So yeah.
So can I just respond to his comment?
Yeah, please.
So there is this idea of, we have these kind of sayings like the elephant in the room or the 800-pound gorilla, that oftentimes like this, that we don't address certain subject matter. And I really think when you think about American history, slavery is it. That's the elephant in the room that we don't want to address. And so, I mean, my hope in all this is, not to make a bunch of money or to get a bunch of attention and things like that, but just to start the conversation in a more maybe informed way through the works. And so that's why they're larger than life. You have to deal with them. They're big.
Yeah, and I can share, I'm the education manager, so I've been having school groups through, and Roberto and I put together this educator packet with questions to have students discuss before they come to the exhibit. And it's been a really wonderful education tool. And we've had great conversations with kids, from second grade through middle school. And so it's definitely been a really wonderful exhibit to have at the museum. And we've had a lot of really great conversations from it, for sure.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, I think those are all our questions for now. But if you have more questions, you can email me. I'm Kirsten at brattleboromuseum.org, or you can email info@brattleboromuseum.org, and I can send your questions to Renee or Roberto or both. And I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and thank Renee and Roberto for being together in this space and having this conversation. It's definitely given me a really nice, deeper understanding of the work. And it was so nice to spend time with you both. I want to, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, can I just have one closing question for
Yes.
Renee before?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yes.
So because of your engagement with these monuments, these historic monuments, and we're there is this current debate. In fact, I teach it in my sculpture class. Like, how would you propose a new monument? How do we have this history of oftentimes heroizing certain figures, whether they be presidents or generals and things like that. And then oftentimes people of color are sort of anonymous bystanders. So how do we, do you have any ideas of how we go about sort of what strategies artists are using now or might use to sort of address this contemporary moment.
So what's interesting is my actual project, the contemporary monuments to the slave past, as well as the digital publication, is about contemporary artists. It is not about objects made in the 19th century. Most of the monuments I look at are made after the 1995. Seems to be a date where we all of a sudden started to pay a little attention to slavery in the landscape. And so for me, one of the big things that I've been really fascinated in the decade that I've been working on this project, way too long, is that there seems to be two ways or a couple ways that people are dealing with. There is the academically trained sculptor who's very proud of their figural work and they're producing figuration in the monumental landscape. So one of the things I've discovered in my project is Harriet Tubman is the most sculpted woman in American history. Like in the public space, it is Harriet Tubman if you're a woman, which is fascinating to me that of all the women who are kind of acknowledged in our public spaces, Harriet Tubman. But then there's actually I did an interview with a group of these designers. I'm really intrigued that designers, architects are kind of moving into the realm of making memorials and monuments. And so I've been looking at a project down at St. Mary's College where two designers who actually started out in a completely different realm got this first commission, and now it's opened up the door. They become monument makers, but it's not monuments in the way that we think about them. They act as to interact. They use language in really interesting ways. They use sounds, soundscapes. I think that some of the designers, architects are thinking really hard, not just about monument in this space, but what is the larger, like what one might call landscape of memory, or the way in which the landscape, right, goes outward. So we might have the monument, let's say at Maryland, that's about the college, but it's actually about historic St. Mary's and colonial slavery. And it takes this kind of abstracted form of a slave cabin with language on it. So I think that also, I don't know if you know of Monument Lab. They are a design studio and history studio in Philadelphia. Of course, Mellon has funded them to the millions of dollars. And so they are working with local communities at rethinking what monuments and memorials should look like in public space. I teach a sculpture class where my students do an intervention in the landscape of Brown University or Providence. And they're fascinating projects where they have to actually really think, like, why is this historic thing here? And what they're doing is really what I ask them to think about is, like, what kinds of stories are those objects telling us now? And how can we flip the narrative? And whether that means draping the statue. One student suggested massive graffiti on a statue. Like, I let them do whatever they wanted. I mean, they didn't actualize these were, conceptual. So this is for we could have a whole conversation about how I actually think it's a problem, actually. So this is, for someone who works on monuments, I think we need to be building less monuments. So that's, I'm someone who's a huge advocate of green space. We need more parks in our urban spaces. We need more shared space where people feel that they can enter without being discriminated because of race or class or religion or gender. And I'm really a huge fan of, we need more contemplative spaces for us to occupy that are green spaces. Our cities need more green spaces. So building another monument is fine, but it doesn't assist us in, let's say, an environmental goal. It may achieve a historical goal. In 50 years, someone will have a different idea of what that story should be that we're representing in space. Monuments are not permanent. This is something I do say over and over again in every lecture, every class I give. They are not, they are meant to be permanent, but we are realizing that monuments take on these afterlives. They're intervened, they're graffitied. We only have to look at Monument Avenue to see, right, what happens to the idea of the lasting monument.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Yeah.
So sorry about that.
We got off on another tangent there.
That was great, and I wish that we, had another hour to keep this going. This is a really wonderful conversation. I had another question from Margaret saying she was fascinated to think of young kids coming to see this exhibition, and can you share some of their reactions? So I just wanted to answer that briefly, and then Roberto, to see if you had any other things you wanted to share. But I can say that I always start with really open-ended questions. with any art exhibit, like getting a visual inventory, getting kids to think visually and just tell me what they're seeing and where and what that makes them think about. And so with that, it takes us a little while to like get to the concepts behind the artwork. And one of the kids was in a group last week, was really excited about the process, Roberto's process, using digital modeling software. He uses digital modeling software, and he saw reflections, between connections between his work and Roberto's. And then we had questions about naked bodies and what it means that these women aren't clothed, and is that appropriate, and how do we feel about seeing a naked body in the museum, and when is that appropriate or not? And so that's always interesting with any art exhibit where there's nudity. And then we had conversations about which figures had chains, and where are the chains broken, where are the chains still in place, what are the colors of the cardboard, and how does that change your impression of the statue. And then we get to that next level of looking at the original. There's like in the exhibit, you can see small images of the original sculptures, the historical sculptures, and thinking about the relationship between the cardboard sculpture and the original, what the material means, what associations they have with cardboard, and then kind of the comparing the different figures that you see, thinking about all of these things together. So a lot of really interesting comments from the students, but they all really understand, they all get to that idea of slavery and freedom, and the materiality of cardboard, the idea that this is a kit that you can buy. So I think it's really accessible, and it's a wonderful education tool to talk about these challenging subjects. So yeah, just wanted, Roberto, do you have anything you want to share about?
I mean, not really. I think that accessibility, like you said, accessibility is a really important thing for me, that there's an entry point into the work. And then I also think that you have to hold people's attention. You have to think about how to be seductive, especially when you're dealing with difficult content, because there are layers of information. There's some surface stuff, but then there's some deeper things that I'm kind of thinking about as I'm building these.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I think with that, we'll kind of wrap it up here. But again, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me or the museum, and I'll connect you with Roberto and Renee. And please come see the exhibit if you haven't already. We're open Wednesday to Sunday, 10 to 4. And the Celebration of Spring exhibits is going to be May 14th. And then Roberto is going to be doing an artist and curator walkthrough with David Rios Ferreira later in the spring. And I'm sorry, I don't have that date on the top of my head, but you can check our website for more programs related to this exhibit. So thank you both so much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
And hope to see you in person soon.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Yes, thank you. Bye-bye.
See you all.
Bye.